And worked for the French newspaper Le Monde. Have I pronounced it right?
Absolutely.
Since 1989, rather between 1989 and 2005.
Yep.
So she has been here in Turkey since 1987, a long time. Currently, as most of you know, she writes for Today's Zaman twice a week, right? And she writes a column for the paper. I feel obliged to mention about your international experience abroad, because I've seen that you've been to interesting places like Baghdad. She lived in Baghdad between 1982 and 83, in South Lebanon and Tehran. Yes. I didn't know that. Yes. I found that out in WikiLeaks. In Tehran, this is very interesting. She's also a well-known author and wrote a book, rather co-wrote a book, that is still relied on for understanding Turkey. It's called Turkey Unveiled, A History of Modern Turkey.
And it's going to be updated this year.
Updated this year, oh, thank you. Well,
it's coming out in the fall in a new edition.
Great news. In autumn, in fall?
In the fall, yeah.
Okay. She covers many aspects of Turkey because she's a journalist, obviously. Turkish life, Turkish people, Turkish history, Turkish politics. However, I know, thank you. I know, personally, that she's especially interested in women's issues. And she's interested in issues on human rights and minorities more than anything else. Her forthcoming book is telling in this respect. It's about honor killings. When is it coming out?
Hopefully at the end of this year.
At the end of 2011. So this we look forward to seeing and reading soon. Apart from that, I guess, what else can I say? You're an analyst, you're a journalist, you're a sort of author, and you're also a political analyst, analyzing, observing, and writing about Turkey. And we are very happy to have welcomed you here for this talk on the women's issues as well as other issues on Turkey. Well, without much ado, I leave the floor to you, and I leave you alone.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Cizre, for inviting me. Now, I hope to make this session an interactive one. I'm not being an academic. I'm much more comfortable answering questions, or rather asking questions, than actually making presentations. But basically what I was told that because of Women's Day yesterday, International Women's Day, I should give a women's perspective on my talk. I think that what I want to give you mainly is a personal account of perhaps my experience of Turkey, how I have approached the country and how I've seen it transformed. Of course, Turkey today is very different from the Turkey I first encountered when I arrived in 1987. But while Turkey has changed a lot, some things have changed rapidly, others have not changed enough. This transformation is still very much ongoing. And perhaps we can discuss some of the aspects that are changing rapidly and positively, and others that are perhaps lagging behind, and that still need to be addressed before Turkey can really truly have the sort of democratic framework that this government says it's working towards. So perhaps I can give you, when I first came to Turkey in 1984 for a holiday, a brief holiday. The weather was miserable. It was in late October. And I can't say that I had a very positive image of Istanbul at first. I mean, of course, the city is beautiful, but the weather was not quite as bad as today, but it was pretty bad. And I remember searching for hotels. I think in the course of a week, we changed 3 times. In those days, the only really good hotel was the Hilton, which was way above our budget. And below that, there were, you know, a lot of very, hotels that weren't really good. You know, you couldn't find hot water in one. There was, you know, problems of cleanliness in another one. So that's certainly, that was my first experience in 1984. Now, of course, this was still relatively soon after the coup period. It was still at a time when the country was just returning to civilian life. By the time I came back in 1987, there was already a big transformation going on. This was the time of Turgut Özal. In fact, I arrived just at the time of the elections in 1987. And already you could see that Turkey was opening up to the world. Of course, Turgut Özal, who I was lucky to meet a few times, was a very charismatic leader. He was sort of short and tubby, but he had real charisma, and I think he also had a vision for Turkey. He really wanted to modernize the country. Unfortunately, while he was doing some important, carrying some important reforms and changing the perception of the country, I think, changing how the country was feeling about itself, partly, it's also the period when the capitalism and consumerism really started in Turkey. But it also started with a lot of corruption. Unfortunately, Özal is remembered as much for his openness and his vision for Turkey as for the corruption that accompanied these changes. Nevertheless, I think that this ANAP period under Turgut Özal was, you know, to a certain extent, it had a lot of similarities with the period that we've seen with the AK Party, although the AK Party has, of course, become much more stronger than the Özal governments even. But the 1990s, which were a period that I covered extensively, in those days I was really working mainly on political issues, since I was working for Le Monde, which is a very serious, perhaps too serious newspaper sometimes, in Paris. And in those days, basically our staple diet as journalists was coalition governments, which were constantly collapsing, reforming, and so internal politics consumed a lot of our time, and the rest of the time was really occupied covering the Kurdish issue. And I think that during that period, throughout the 90s, in many ways it was a lost decade for Turkey. There was not much of significance happened during that period because the government was, because the governments were so weak. There was such a political stalemate, and the political scene in general was just too fractured for anything important to take place. And the Kurdish issue, of course, meant that the army became much more present also in political life. And I think that perhaps when you look at that period, perhaps it should also be a warning for the AK Party, because during the Özal time, he had managed to keep the army at bay quite successfully, to the point that, you know, when the chief of staff opposed his policy when the first Gulf War began, the chief of staff ended up resigning. And of course there was this very famous occasion when Özal came back from a holiday, and he reviewed the army. I mean, the troops wearing shorts and a t-shirt. That was, which at the time got the officers very upset, obviously. It was quite an amazing photo. But anyway, so there was this period when Özal had managed to push the limits a little bit and push the army a bit further back. But then in the 1990s, I think we saw a comeback of the army, largely because of the Kurdish conflict, which really, after the first Gulf War, became the major issue in Turkey. And also because the political power was so weak during this period, which meant that the politicians were simply not able to really impose their will. Now, the Kurdish conflict, I think, since I spent so much time covering that issue and spending a lot of time in the southeast, I think that it's still an issue that has not been well understood in Western Turkey. I think that few people have really grasped up to this day to the extent of the conflict, that there really was a war going on inside Turkey. I think that at the time, certainly people didn't know or didn't want to know here, because I've had countless arguments with friends and acquaintances during that period. And no one wanted to see quite to what extent the local population was under pressure, suffering. All these villages were being, the villages being burnt by the army. Of course, the PKK also committed some atrocities. And a lot of people, to this day, are still suffering the consequences of these policies, because hundreds of thousands of people were forced to leave their villages and ended up in the suburbs of the big cities. And if you go to the back streets of Diyarbakir, the poverty is absolutely shocking. And this is something that unfortunately has not yet been addressed properly. I did some research on the economy of Diyarbakir, I think it was 3 or 4 years ago, in the winter, on a cold winter like this. There was a lot of snow. And some of the kids in the back streets of Diyarbakir were barefoot, wearing slippers, and subsisting on very little. And unfortunately, I returned this a few months ago, and again looked at, investigated the poverty among those migrants, those displaced people. And I met families who were subsisting on the 25 lira that their children earned, because the children were the only ones who had a job, and they were earning 25 lira a week. So this is still a problem that I think remains very urgent to address. And unfortunately, the government, I mean, the Prime Minister tried to launch the Kurdish initiative, but I think that somehow, and this is one of the difficulties in Turkey, is that the nationalism is still very strong, and you just scratch the surface, and it immediately erupts. And of course, it was very difficult to push these policies through. And of course, politicians are worried about losing votes. Personally, I think that any politicians who would actually manage to put an end to this conflict once and for all, and to secure peace, would win a lot of votes. But somehow, I think that even though the government was initially well-intentioned, I think that it didn't have quite the courage to push it through. But still, when we, when you look at the 1990s, this completely, wasted decade, really, when not enough happened in this country. Of course, when the past 10 years, or especially the past 8 years, have certainly brought a tremendous change. Of course, the AK Party was also, I think, in many ways lucky in the timing of its arrival. There had been, after all these coalition governments, we had the big economic crisis in 2001, which forced the complete restructuring of the economy. And somehow, by the time the AK Party came, those policies were already in place, partly with Kemal Dervish, the minister in charge of the economy, had already started transforming the Turkish economy. So the AK Party was, already had a much more solid ground to begin with. And of course, it was also, I think, that the timing of the AK Party's arrival was, we could already feel the wind of change in the society. I think that everybody was very tired of all the previous political parties after a decade of bickering and political tension. The country was really ready for a strong government that would bring some stability. And this was the time when the EU process was also beginning to take shape, or at least take some step forwards, because of course it's been a roller coaster ride. So basically, when the AK Party came, we had, on the one hand, the IMF, which provided some anchor for the economy, and started, as a result, also suddenly made Turkey a more attractive country to invest in, because, of course, the economic prosperity of the country is an important factor of attraction for the AK Party, I think, for the voters. While the EU was providing a kind of blueprint for the reforms, and in the first 2 or 3 years of the AK Party coming to power, we saw that these, basically the party looked at this blueprint and started to implement some important reforms, some important political reforms. And there was really a period, I think, when a period of great hope for the transformation, the democratic transformation of Turkey. Unfortunately, I think that the reforms slowed down after 2004, 2005. We saw that the reforms slowed down, partly, I think, because the AK Party was under intense pressure, and we've seen subsequently that, with all these Ergenekon plots and all these attempts to undermine the legitimacy of the government or even to topple it, clearly created a lot of pressure and caused the reform process to slow down. On the other hand, this also coincided with a period where Europe was also beginning to question its own enlargement. Of course, there had been the attacks of 9/11 that also caused a lot of anti-Muslim sentiment in the Western world, and especially in Europe, where we see now that it's really reached quite alarming levels. Islamophobia is really has become a problem. So this in part explains why the reforms slowed down. But of course, now the question is, how do you go forward from where we are now? Clearly, the AK Party, unless something really unexpected happened, the AK Party is going to win the elections, and it's probably going to win with big margins. Now, of course, some of the changes that have happened in the recent period are still, I think, relatively fragile, and I think that Turkey badly needs a proper framework for to ensure that the changes are permanent, Turkey needs a new constitution. Unfortunately, in the current polarized atmosphere, I think it is very difficult to, how do you get people together to write a constitution when they can barely talk to each other? So I think that it's going to be a very difficult process. I hope that it takes place because it's much needed. We'll also have to see what happens after the elections in terms of, I mean, we know that Mr. Erdogan, the Prime Minister, would like a presidential system. Personally, I think that it would be very unwise. I don't think that it would be good for Turkey because in any case, I think that one of the problems in the political, in Turkey's political makeup is that there's not enough democracy within the parties. It's still too much based, politics are based really on the leader. And I think that it would be very difficult for a parliament to be able to have the checks and balances to make a presidential system sustainable and democratic in this environment. And in fact, I think that it's, you know, the fact that the leader is always so important in political parties also makes one wonder what will happen to the, you know, AK Party after Mr. Erdogan decides to step out. It's almost, it's difficult to see how it will survive or who can take the party forward with such a strong hand. Now, Turkey has arrived at, obviously Turkey is in a good position on many fronts. I mean, economically it's doing well. It has survived the economic crisis much better than most countries, including most European countries, which is partly why the European project also appears so unattractive these days to the Turks, because somehow the European countries no longer have quite as much to offer to Turkey as they used to. But I think that what is happening now in the Middle East and the instability that it's creating, the prices, the oil prices going up, also shows that perhaps, you know, Europe is growing slowly, but it's at least offering relative stability. Whereas some of the new markets that Turkey has discovered and, you know, very successfully in its new proactive diplomacy, it's also very much an economic diplomacy as well. It's linked very much to trade and to investment. And some of these markets obviously are likely to be unstable for a while. And the other thing is that the Turkish economy, although the indicators overall are very good, is still quite vulnerable to outside shocks, such as the rise of the price of oil, which again could be a feature that we'll see for, you know, that could last for a while, because Turkey has an economy that is relies very heavily on the import of energy. And so that, you know, that could also create some imbalances. And of course, as if the region ends up engulfed in instability for a long period, which we hope won't happen, but it can also reduce the appetite of investors for putting their money in this part of the world. And Turkey needs a lot of liquidity, it needs a lot of capital to fund its current account deficit. So this is an imbalance that is, you know, this is a vulnerability that Turkey still has, even though a lot of things have changed. The other vulnerability that I see is more a domestic one. I think that the government has managed to put the army on the defensive and to change the balance of civilian-military relations, but it has not really consolidated this position. And to the point that sometimes one wonders if, it seems quite willing to come to some kind of accommodation as long as the military leave it alone. For instance, the oversight of the military budget, the government could have passed a much stronger law to really make sure that make sure that there was more transparency, and yet somehow it chose to hold back. And I think that it's the kind of decisions that could come back to haunt it in the future. Another aspect, I think that there's a lot of discussion these days about the freedom of the press following the arrest of these journalists in the context of the Ergenekon case. Now, I personally do not know these men, but as far as I know, they were among the people who were supporting the Ergenekon investigation. But whoever, even if they were to some extent related to the whole Ergenekon plots, even if they were writing in support of the plotters, which as far as I haven't seen any evidence of that, I think that there's a real danger that the whole case could be undermined by going after players that were only very minor players, if they were players at all. And I think that it's important to conclude this case, and unfortunately, because so many people are being arrested, and then you have, people, Nazlı Ilıcak has to testify about her private life in the context of a case that is supposed to be about plots to topple the government. So I think that there's a real risk that the whole thing is going to be diluted. And I think that the prosecutors should really focus on the core issues, the core players and the core defendants, and try to get some convictions, because I think that otherwise we saw it 14 years ago with the Susurluk affair, where suddenly there was an investigation going on, and then the momentum got lost somehow. And it would be, I think, very detrimental to the government if that were allowed to happen. And now, before I take your questions, I also wanted to mention and go back to the issue that I've been following more closely in recent years. It's really the gender issue. I think that it's one aspect of Turkey's transformation, Turkey's social transformation, that where the current government is the weakest. We see that the figures are really quite appalling. We see that Turkey, the World Economic Forum, puts out a gender gap index every year. Turkey currently ranks 126 out of 134 countries, which is not a very good result, given that it had important reforms in the 1930s, giving women the right to vote and to be elected, and that 80 years later we're still only at this level. And not only are women not progressing, but they are actually regressing. When it comes to employment, for instance, 15 years ago it was about 33% of women in the labor force. Now we're down to 22%. And even the 22% includes women who are unpaid family workers, in rural areas, mostly employed in agriculture, working on the field that belongs to their family, and they don't get a salary. But of course they are productive. But the actual urban employment labor force participation is incredibly low. It's below 18. It's below. I think it's around 18% currently. And you know, when you think that in the European Union it's around 60%, you have really an enormous gap. Turkey is still lagging behind. And this is largely due to the fact that, first of all, there are traditional perceptions of women, and I think that the conservatism is coming to the fore more than it was in the past, and you can see it in, you know, the statements from ministers. You can see it all over the place in the way women are always seen as mothers. Whenever you hear politicians talking about women, they're always talking about mothers, but not so much about women as individuals. Now, of course, mothers are very important, but a lot of women actually want to have another dimension to their life, and there's been very little done in terms of providing cheap childcare or affordable childcare or elderly care. It's just on that front, I think that the state has still fails women. And of course, the other dimension, and that's even more urgent to address, is the violence. And the violence has been increasing. You've probably noticed that almost every time you open your newspaper, there's 1 or 2 women who have been killed, and most of the time they are killed by their husbands or their ex-husbands. And it really shows that as in most cases, there are women who have been trying to get a divorce because they were abused, and so when they divorce or seek a divorce, they get killed. And what is particularly alarming is that about 48% of these women who get killed had alerted the authorities. They had filed complaints with the prosecutors, they had gone to the police station, but somehow had not received the protection that the state should really give them. And now they're talking about improving the law. There is actually a law in terms of legislation. Turkey is not behind, actually. It revised its civil code in 2002. In 2005, a new penal code was introduced, and the feminist groups had formed a very strong lobby, and they managed to change as the draft of this new penal code was prepared, they managed to influence the writing of it, and really there were about 30 articles that they managed to have changed in a favorable way. Introducing laws that really were more favorable to women, in particular when it comes to any kind of physical assault and crime. In the previous penal code, rape, for instance, was not seen as a crime against individuals, but it was a crime against public morality, or so the victim was the society, not the individual. So obviously the women worked very hard to change these perceptions, and that was enshrined in the penal code that was introduced in 2005. And in fact, in 1998, Turkey had introduced a law that many Western countries have as well, but Turkey was even ahead of the times, and some of the European countries did it only later, a law that allows basically magistrates to immediately order, in case a woman is being abused by her husband, a judge can immediately order the man to be removed for a period of up to 6 months, basically protecting the woman and her children and preventing him from getting anywhere near her. But unfortunately, again, it's a question of social perceptions. First of all, it's proven very difficult for a lot of women to actually apply for protection, because of course when women don't work and don't have financial resources of their own, they hesitate to have the breadwinner removed from the family, although now it's, they're trying to provide some financial support for women. But the other problem is that, of course, Turkey still, and it's not a bad thing in itself, but the idea is really to protect the family, and in fact, this law was called the law to protect the family, rather than to protect members, individual members of the family. And because of the way it was phrased initially, and that again is going to be, I think, further reformed. Certainly, there's a new law proposal that is going to be submitted to Parliament. Because of the way it was phrased, it only applied to married women. That meant that, women who were living with someone who were not married, or women who were abused by a boyfriend or an ex-husband, also the women who were only had a religious marriage but had not, did not have legal papers, were not always protected. It really depended on how the judge decided to implement the law. And this is really, I think, the core of the problem. There's still not a proper discussion on gender relations in this society. And as we go through this, Turkey is trying to become more democratic, and yet somehow I think that women are still largely absent from a lot of the discussions. 18 months ago, I was invited to Ankara for a conference, a 3-day conference on democratization, and it was organized by a union. They had 50 speakers for 3 days on democratization, and 2 of them were women. So I talked about women's rights and the fact that perhaps including half the population in the debate on democratization might be important. And of course, I addressed a room of men. I think there were 2 women in the room. And I think that this is really a major issue, because this, not just because of the women themselves, but I think this very aggressive, macho masculinity in Turkey affects everything. When you look at politics, and when you see how divided and polarized the country is today, I think it has a lot to do with the fact that the leaders cannot talk to each other without shouting, insulting each other. There's absolutely no culture of consensus. Also, what is quite clear, again, at this weekend, I was at a conference where women in the media were discussed, and when you hear the men talk about women playing a more important role, yes, they're willing to leave them a little space, but there's absolutely no concept of gender roles being challenged. Yes, women can come as long as they still cook for the mother-in-law when she comes to visit. She still looks after the children. There's absolutely, I still see no debate on the role of men in the society. And I think that this is, at this stage, women's groups have raised awareness of violence, and of course we need to continue working on these issues. But I think that at this stage, Turkey needs to have a men's movement. I think that men who believe that they have a different role to play in the society should come forward and not be afraid of showing a softer side, perhaps. Whereas until now, I think that being soft or admitting that you might sometimes cook a meal at home would, men would feel very threatened. So I think that for Turkey to go forward and also for Turkey to really become more democratic, you have to address this deficit on the gender front, because when you don't have, when half the population is missing from the debate, I think that it simply cannot be a real democratic debate. So I'll leave it at that, and I'll take your questions if you have any.
Thank you so much for the talk. I apologize for my voice. I'm getting some laryngitis, it sounds like. It's great, wonderful seeing you here. I just wanted to add something about what you said about the difficulties for women leaving their abusers. You mentioned the economic reasons being really important. Also, not having enough number of shelters. Where would they go? It's a completely systemic issue. For example, not having enough number of shelters for the number of population, like for each neighborhood. How many shelters we have total in Turkey? I think it's less than 100. But we need many more than that for women to feel comfortable to go. Also, perceptions, you mentioned social perceptions are extremely important. How judges, security officials, lawyers, doctors, teachers, people, like, it's not that we don't know the abuse happens. We know, like everybody knows, but we have no idea as far as how the system works, how you're going to refer. Like, I work as a therapist. If my patient is being abused, how am I going to refer her? Where? Is she going to be safe? Ayşe Paşalı was killed in 2000. She was denied order of protection because she was divorced. And then they changed the law after her because she wasn't married at the time. And the Ministry of Aliye Kavaf at that time said this is just an individual case, but they changed the law after her. I guess you were also referring to that kind of resistance to acknowledging, yes, there is something going on, we can do something about it, but there is resistance to it. My question was going to be maybe two questions. Have you seen the billboards as far as March 8? Kadına şiddet uygulayan erkek değildir. What do you, like, how do you evaluate that message? Erkek değildir. And second question, as far as Erdogan's personality and male image, I saw his talk yesterday night, and just complete opposite to what you said about motherhood being the most sacred role that a woman can have. He consistently highlights our values, our tradition, our values, motherhood being extremely important. Cennet annelerin ayakları altındadır, etc. What do you think? Do you think this has to change, or can we still have change in Turkey along with this type of thinking or messages? Thank you.
Do you mean can we have change while still talking about family values? You mean?
Yes. Yes.
Well, I think. Yes, I think that obviously Turkey is a conservative country, and other countries have remained, even in the West, you have people talking about family values while having, a freer environment or a slightly more friendly environment for women. But of course, as we know, violence against women exists everywhere. But as you said, the number of shelters is still very, very low. And I remember a few years ago, I was doing interviews, and a friend in Ankara was actually telling me she was talking to a mayor, the mayor of one of the Ankara district, and she was asking him why he didn't have a shelter in his district, because normally, according to the law, the municipalities are supposed to have shelters. But again, this is one of these laws that somehow never really gets implemented. And he said, oh, but we don't really want a shelter because otherwise all the women will go there. You know, and I think that was very revealing of the mentality, you know, as if all the women aspire to live in a shelter. That's hardly the case, you know. Obviously, if men are so frightened that their wives are going to leave them, perhaps they could treat them a bit better and give them some incentives to stay. But I think that, you know, I think that the government, in fact, has it's very contradictory what's happening in many ways, because on the one hand, you have the politicians, the prime minister constantly talking about family values, about women having more children, preserving the extended family. And at the same time, this is a government that's pushed neoliberal economic policies, which are very much at the root of Western individualism. You know, it's in an urban environment, doing well or economically is very different from in a rural environment. When you buy a piece of land, you become wealthier, but the piece of land is going to benefit the whole family, an extended family. If you buy yourself the latest BMW, somehow it doesn't have quite the same effect on the extended family. So I think that on the one hand, they want to hang on to these values, and I think that there's a lot of positive aspects to these values too. I don't think that, I'm certainly not, I don't believe that the families should disappear. But I think that there's this contradiction where on the one hand they want to hang on to things and that things should remain as they are. But on the other hand, with these economic policies, it's quite clear that I think that women will have to get into the workforce if people, the sort of aspirations that have been created through economic prosperity and a growing middle class and so on, I just don't see how people are going to have their holidays, their car, their TVs, flat screen TVs on one salary. It doesn't seem to, certainly in the West, no one has managed to do that. Most families have two salaries, or at least 1.5, because they cannot get everything they want or the lifestyle they want on one salary. So I think there's this contradiction.
The contradictory effects of neoliberal economy on Turkey. The list is endless, let me tell you this. By killing this animal husbandry in the southeast and by delivering a terrible blow to Turkey's agriculture, it's also actually, encouraged or enhanced Turkey's Kurdish question, in a way. It's made it more serious. Nobody seems to talk about it. Yeah. But you're quite right, in terms of disregarding this particular aspect of Turkish politics. I was actually thinking about, again, this violence on women, of course, regarding that question. I was thinking about the politics of it. In other words, the political factors impacting this violence, more so perhaps, or equally as what you consider Turkish conservatism, the deficiency on the gender roles side, or the perception of gender roles, deficiency perhaps in legal protection given to women, institutional factors, factors relating to conservative values, family values, the mindset of Turkish men. But there is also something called the impact of war.
I mean, Turkey is in
absolutely.
war. I mean,
Yeah.
and we are trying to sort of lead normal lives, you know,
Yeah.
regular lives. I mean, we have our lives which is separated from war, whereas we are saturated with violence and war
Absolutely.
and warfare and so on and so forth. So how do you think it's possible to not to be affected by the war over there, apparently, not here, while our lives over here is actually securitized, you know, and full of discourse of war and militarized and so on and so forth.
Absolutely.
So the role of conscription I wanted you to touch upon.
I think it's, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think that's why also it's important to bring the men in the debate. And I think that some of the more, I think that sometimes the feminist groups want to keep the men at bay. I think it's important to get the men involved as well, because I think that in order for them to really understand what they are doing, they also need to be conscious of perhaps the pressure they are also under. I mean, you know, I have a friend, for instance, who had a little boy who was quite sensitive, for instance. Not as quite as macho as she should have been, but from the, you know, the first week at school he was hit by the teacher. And already, you know, he found it much more difficult to integrate into school, and the teachers could not understand that he was a kid who needed attention and who needed, because it's just not something that is really part of the thinking. And then, of course, as you say, I think that this conscription also has a double effect. On the one hand, you know, being a soldier is such an important thing. You become a citizen when you're a soldier, which of course excludes the women to begin with. They're not full citizens, but also I think that from what I hear and from what I've read, a lot of men are exposed to violence also during their military service. So again, this is where this, you know, becoming a man is part of the violence is part of becoming a man. And then it also, at least in the way it is implemented through conscription. And I think that unfortunately it does have long-term effects on, you know, on the people's psyche and their understanding of gender roles as well. And it's very unfortunate.
If I may, would you favor conscription being removed? I mean, let's say compulsory military, or would you, as some people do, would you favor women? Conscription being also available or made compulsory for women? So,
well, I mean, that's with the Israeli model, you mean? Yeah. Well, I mean, personally, I think Turkey would be much better off with the professional army, frankly. First of all, because whether or not one agrees on policies and so on, but it's quite clear that when it came to actually fighting the PKK, it was not always very effective. And you had these untrained privates, I mean, almost cannon fodder, really, being sent quite unprepared to fight people who had been, you know, quite hardened by living in the mountains for a long time. So they were completely, I think that there were casualties that could certainly have been avoided if you had better trained people. But of course, that I think that conscription I think it's also a tool for social engineering in this country, and I think that it's perhaps why the army is so reluctant to accept even discussing a professional army, because I think that it's very much part of the indoctrination process for Turkish men to go through the military service and to be taught a certain view of the world apart from the military skills.
Just going on from the PKK and the Kurdish issue, and you mentioned that it hasn't been solved with the military force and tactics. I mean, what annoys me as a a British person, and I think your husband's British, is that right?
Ex-husband, yes.
Yeah, sorry.
No, that's okay.
Ex-husband, and you're Swiss.
Yeah.
Yeah. The Western media, the Turkish media, the ones I've read, often, what I know about the discussion of the Kurdish initiative is they often refer to the Spanish
the Basque
approach.
model.
Yeah, the approach and ETA,
Or
which hasn't really been solved, in my opinion, whereas the British approach with the IRA has more or less been solved. I mean, do you think that looking at what happened between Britain and Sinn Féin and the whole IRA business, there is a better model for Turkey, or?
Well,
or
I
not?
mean, you know, I can't say that I know enough about the details, but clearly, I mean, what Britain did is that it actually engaged in negotiations with the people that, you know, were, I mean, with Sinn Féin, which Turkey is not prepared to do at this point. Unfortunately, you do have, the Kurds are represented in parliament, but it's still incredibly difficult for the other political parties and for the government. Somehow, it's still very reluctant to engage in serious discussions with them. But of course, there's also the fact that on the Kurdish side too, I mean, you know, I think that when you look at the two nationalism, they're a mirror image of each other. And unfortunately, you see on the Kurdish side, you also see the same cult of the personality. You see a lot of the very hardline approach, which can be understandable given how, you know, the policies that have been imposed upon them. But on the other hand, of course, this hardline approach does not make it easier. And certainly now, with the elections 3 months away, unfortunately, it seems quite clear that on both sides, there are more votes to be won by being hardline and nationalist, rather than in trying to you know, to tone things down. So, of course, that means that after the elections, when inevitably at some point we'll have to again address the Kurdish issue, it will be, again, that much harder because we'll have another layer of nationalism on both sides that has been added. And that is the problem, you know. And in many ways, I think that the Kurdish opening, I mean, the initiative launched by the government had created huge expectations, and then the government retreated and in many ways has made things harder for itself. You know, it had opened a breach, but having retreated, I think each time it's a little bit more difficult because the demands are, you know, there's more demands added to the list. On the other hand, you know, when I look at how much things have changed in the past 20 years, around the time I started working as a journalist in Turkey, this was the time when I think it was about then that the first time the word Kurd was printed in a newspaper, on the front page of a newspaper, you know, a headline that used the word. Before that, they were mounted Turks. Throughout the 1990s, whenever we wanted to talk about, I talked about the Kurdish issue with friends or whatever, we only did it in private at home. You couldn't discuss it in a cafe, or, you know, or you would look over your shoulder and wonder who was listening. Nowadays, the level of debate has changed radically. And you see that there's discussions of Kurdish education. I mean, it's controversial, people are unhappy, but it's discussed. It's openly being discussed. And in my mind, there's no doubt that at some point in the not too distant future, we will see Kurdish offered in schools. So it's, you know, sometimes it's frustrating, and there's a lot of time wasted and people killed unnecessarily, unfortunately. But at the same time, you do see that the level of debate and things are moving but not quite as fast as we would like them to.
Can I ask another question, slightly
Sure.
related, because you were talking about rapid change in Turkey in the last decade or so under AK Party, and you also, in your book, which I've read, which I really love, by the way, you also mentioned about Turgut Özal reforming a lot and changing a lot about Turkey, and there's one anecdote in the book which always sticks out in my mind, which is about Turgut Özal, who changed so many things. And I just wanted to ask you, was this something that you learned directly, or was it second-hand information, which was Turgut Özal said once, you know, what can we do now? Shall we apologize for the Armenian genocide? Which was used in a humorous context in the book, I have to add. Was that something that he said to you or Hugh Pope, or is it something that you just heard from another reporter?
I have to admit I can't remember.
Oh, okay.
I have to admit I can't remember. But I think that it's the kind of thing that he would have said, he could have said publicly quite easily. I mean, he was interesting in that sense. You know, he was really the first one who was thinking outside the box. It was so refreshing because you could see that he was able to come up with these things. Of course, sometimes it went a little bit too far, and but it was refreshing because he had understood quite a lot of things about this country. And you talk about the Armenian issue. I think that one thing that we're getting towards that, but again, it's part of the process of change. There's still a great difficulty in connecting the dots, I think, in Turkey. We have now this Ergenekon investigation that looks at the very recent past, events of the recent past. But, you know, the Turkish history is sort of littered with these episodes that left part of the population, you know, really caused a lot of suffering to one part or the other of the population. But somehow the population is so polarized and divided that everybody focuses on their own suffering, and it's still very difficult to get the full picture and to see that it's all part of the same thing. And perhaps that if everybody got together to actually change that context that created that, everybody would benefit. And that's where having a constitution that really gives people individual rights, so that, you know, if you're Jewish, or if you're Armenian, or if you're a Kurd, or if you're an Islamist, or if you're gay, or if you're whatever, you know, you're not going to suffer pressure. But I think that I think it's actually quite interesting at the moment, because suddenly you have these books coming out, suddenly you have people coming out with personal histories. I mean, on the Armenian front, we've seen some Turks come, like the lawyer Fethiye Çetin, who wrote this book about her grandmother, who turned out to be Armenian, but she didn't know about it for most of her life. You have people talking about their experience in prison. You have, you know, the other day I interviewed Isaac Alaton, who's a well-known industrialist who I've known for a very long time, and he's been very active in civil society. And we were talking about the pain of the past and you know, how you deal with the past. And then suddenly he said, well, you know, not many people know about this, but I have a brother who lives in Sweden, and it turned out that he had a brother who witnessed the 1955 events in September, you know, when there were these riots mainly against the Greeks and the non-Muslims, and all of Istiklal Street was looted and destroyed. And he was so traumatized that he decided to leave the country. And he has not set foot in the country since then. So, you know, this is, you have these, everybody, almost every family or every little group has its own pain, really, its own tragedy. And of course, in the case of Alaton's family, his father had already lost everything he had. He was a businessman, and he lost everything when Turkey introduced the varlık vergisi, the wealth tax on non-Muslims during the Second World War. So everybody has their story, you know. There are people who have lived horrific experiences after the 1980 coup, but again, you didn't hear very much about it. Somehow they got out of prison, they pushed the torture and all this aside, and they returned to society. But suddenly I think that Turkey is feeling the need to address the past. And so you have these stories coming out, and of course on the Kurdish front we've had quite a few stories already. Perhaps the Kurds were the most, what happened to the Kurds is the best known. But I think slowly all these things are coming out, and it's quite interesting to see how perhaps we will eventually have a full picture, and that's when Turkey can really move forward, I think.
I have an objection about your words about the polarization in the society. I mean that the polarization is really too hard word to conceptualize the situation now is going on in society. I mean, Turkish society, I will say that, because it's the polarization, it's that there's still threshold, never jump to this threshold. We see it's under the threshold of the tensions, I mean the hot tensions between, among the groups that they divided different views. I mean between the secularists or the Kemalist and or you will say Democrats or Islamists, whatever you want to say, or the different liberals or so on and so forth. Actually, apart from that, my question is most relating to the opening initiatives. How these opening initiatives will create a kind of, how they are creating a new kind of the self-confidence, both, I mean, in an ethnical base, or religious base, or gender base. I mean, now it's, especially if you make a comparison 25 years ago and today's, how do you see these opening initiatives brought to a new kind of self-confidence or not? Or do you see an optimism to be a self-confidence to discuss everything?
Yes, no, definitely. I mean, I think that the society is much more open today than it was then. And I think that I take your point about the polarization. I mean, I think that where the polarization is at its worst, I think it's really in the elite, in the sort of, that's where you find that the tension is in the upper echelons of the society. I think the tension is much more acute than it is on the street, really, because you see, I mean, certainly among the young people or among the people on the street, you see that they mix much more easily. But in the sort of, I don't know, I hate the word intellectual, but, you know, the sort of educated elite, there's a lot more polarization, I think. But I think that people are definitely more self-confident, and because they can also express themselves publicly more easily. As I said, you know, in the 1990s, there were some things that you would just not discuss in public because you were afraid of being overheard, or these, you know, people today who say that it's become a republic of fear. I don't know where they were in the 1990s. And I mean, I'm critical of some of the things that are happening now, but I think when you look back at that period, it was really very, very tense. So people are definitely much more confident when it comes to expressing their views. So I think that there are good things happening.
To pave a way for more, I mean, more equal or not equal, just positions for in ethnical base or gender base, so on and so forth.
Well,
How it affect, I mean, that your perspective on future?
Well, I think that, again, some of the debates that are taking place, it all boils down to giving people more individual rights as opposed to, you know, lumping them into a group and deciding that to stick a label on them. And I think that this idea of identity, again, I think that it was very much part of the state ideology that was imposed, where being a good Turkish citizen meant being Turkish ethnic. I think ethnically Turkish means being Sunni, but preferably not practicing. You know, and everybody else was not quite, didn't quite fit the description. Whereas I think that today the idea that people can have multiple identities is becoming accepted a little bit more. And certainly the Kurds are trying to put, you know, I think that even the Prime Minister in some of his more positive statement acknowledged he was the first to really acknowledge publicly that it was possible to have more than one identity. And then, of course, that problem of the label, if you can be both a Kurd and a Turkish citizen and, you know, and perhaps add some more layer, you can be Kurdish and a Turkish citizen, and you can be a woman. And, you know, there's... as long as you have individual rights, then these labels become less important, I think.
You're right. I think this is the end of this very fruitful and enlightening session. I think, in fact, I mean, it's very, very sort of promising to end with this optimistic note about, you know, a better Turkey, a more just society, with more human rights, more rule of law. So I really would like to thank you on behalf of Sehir University for, you know, having come here today.
It's been a pleasure.